Welcome to the Backpacking Light podcast, where we discuss the philosophy and skills of traveling light so you can experience the outdoors with more comfort, more safety, and more enjoyment. I'm Ryan Jordan.
And I'm Andrew Marshall, and we are your hosts on this lifelong journey of doing more with less as we venture into wild places and empty spaces.
Look for me in the mountains, where walking has a way of pulling you to your peace of mind every day.
Well, this episode of the BPL podcast is all about trekking poles. Trekking poles are maybe a surprisingly contentious item of gear in the ultralight world. Ryan, why do you think that is?
I think it's because you are adding something to your hands that's extra weight in your kit. And it's not only something that sometimes you have to carry on the back of your pack, but it's something that you potentially are carrying in your hands all the time. And so there's probably a lot of debate over whether trekking poles are worth that added weight or not. At least in the ultralight world, I think the debates typically center around the central question, which is, are they worth the weight?
Right. So in this episode, we have not one but two different interviews to share with you guys. After that, we're going to dig into some research that's been done about trekking poles. Then we're going to tackle some fact or fiction, sort of anecdotal statements about trekking poles, and finally wrap it up with some gear items and talk about the big 10,000 word trekking pole gear guide that Backpacking Light just published. So, without any further ado, we're just going to jump straight into our interviews. So, our first guest is Rob Shaul. Rob is the founder and head coach at the Mountain Tactical Institute in Jackson, Wyoming, where he trains and coaches mountain athletes of all kinds, as well as military service members deployed in mountainous areas. MTI has done some pretty interesting research on trekking poles, and we can't wait to share Rob's insights with you. All right, Rob, thanks for joining us on the Backpacking Light podcast. Can you tell us a little bit about the Mountain Tactical Institute, what you guys do?
Yeah, Mountain Tactical Institute is kind of a facility and a company I started over a decade now. And we started out as a mountain athlete, and I had grown up in Pinedale, Wyoming, and had a business there and kind of sold that, and had always been a gym rat. And so I moved up north to Jackson. I wanted to start out kind of working out with or training, working with mountain guides. And we were soon to find out, once we started doing it, that there was little work that had been done, and definitely no research and a very little theory on how to train for mountain sports in a gym-based environment and how to train for them in general. So we started working with mountain guides, and initially kind of applied stick and ball strength conditioning programming to them to not very good effect. And so soon we started to develop our own programming theory. And a few years after that, relatively soon after I started, guys in the military were stationed downrange in Afghanistan, Iraq. Started following our sessions online. There was a lot of interest, especially from guys deploying to Afghanistan and mountainous regions, and how to train for that specifically. And so we built a training program we called it the Afghanistan Pre-Deployment Training Plan, to help guys prepare for uphill movement under load and downhill movement under load. And we ended up giving that program away to tens of thousands of guys. Entire battalions used it to get ready, and that was really what made our mark for us there on the military side. And after a few years, we kind of combined the two instead of working different ends, and I renamed the company the Mountain Tactical Institute. And we took a pretty hard turn towards research and started researching different ideas. And now we've researched all types of movement, especially movement under load, vertical movement. And there really hasn't, on the research side, been a lot of work done on this, especially in the academic world. And we had to develop some of our own research techniques and ways that we do research. And so that's kind of where we are now.
That's really exciting to me. I've been fascinated by the entire body of research, as you call it, movement under load, vertical movement under load. And for us, it obviously has some impact in mountaineering and backpacking, and it's neat to see this genre of fitness centers and gyms kind of expand as well. They're, at least here in the Rockies, we are fortunate to have a number of these. There's Jim Jones in Utah, and up in Montana, there's Mountain Tough Fitness, and you guys in here in Wyoming. So it's a cool thing to watch evolve, and the training, especially. I had the chance to train under Scott Johnston and Steve House, and learn some of these techniques, and it blew my mind, the impacts it could have when you started really paying attention to training specifically for these kind of sports.
Yeah, we made a lot of mistakes early on, but as we learned, and for us, what has always driven our programming, our fitness programming, has been outside performance, and that has really helped us focus our efforts and led to the research and our gym training and other programming that we do. If it doesn't improve outside performance, then we quickly move on from it.
That's great. I'm really glad to have you on the show. We'd like to discuss a series of articles you guys have published over the past few years that investigate whether or not trekking poles specifically have a benefit for hiking and backpacking. So, the primary question posed by kind of both of the studies we've been talking about, and we'll link those in our show notes, is this: do trekking poles make you more efficient? How did you guys tackle this question, and what did you discover? Were you able to answer this?
We tackled this in a couple different methods. We wanted to see the effect of trekking poles um, just on a horizontal flat surface, if we could see any difference between using them and not using them, and then also going uphill in a vertical climb. And so the first study, we just had 4 athletes, and we just had them go with trekking poles and without trekking poles just around a track, and then kept track of breathing rate and heart rate and some other measures. And that study found that there really was no difference between trekking poles and non-trekking poles based on the athletes who used them. Anecdotally, I kind of started using trekking poles there in my 30s. I'm 50 now, and I just found they seem to make a huge difference in terms of making me move faster. But they also use more from a fitness perspective and a physiological perspective, because you're using your upper body. They also conceivably could use more energy. So even though you're moving faster, you may be using more energy to do it. So you may or may not be more efficient. For our vertical study, we did pretty much the same thing. We just climbed up Snow King Mountain here in Jackson, and it was during a ski season, so the athletes actually took their skis up and skied or snowboarded down. But they did a test with trekking poles and without. And that study did. We got some data back from that. First, in terms of perceived exertion. The athletes decided that it felt easier to use trekking poles moving uphill, and it seems that most of us who do that certainly is what it feels like. But also physiological data, we got a return that said that it is also 10% more efficient, which is kind of interesting. So kind of what we discovered based on these 2 studies that we did was that horizontally, trekking poles don't seem to make that much of a difference, but definitely moving uphill they do in terms of efficiency.
For the purpose of our listeners, what define efficiency for them?
Going the same speed with less effort.
Okay. And how did you guys measure effort?
The idea, the theory is that heart rate and running speed have a linear relationship, and it's a way of looking at data that's typically used to assess endurance training adaptation. And that if you have an increase in the heart rate and running speed numbers, it increases efficiency. And when we applied this equation to the data we got from both of the studies, we found that there were the uphill movement, the trekking poles were 10% more efficient than non-trekking poles, and horizontally, there was no significant difference.
And you had your athletes under load both of these studies, correct? Or just one?
Yes, I'm sorry, they were loaded with approximately 40% of their body weight. So yeah, most of our studies are loaded, so I just want to verify that. But they had 50 to 75 pounds they were carrying.
Can you just get into the nuts and bolts of how you constructed this study and how you tried to limit variables? Because our audience is really interested in that kind of thing.
Let me just take a look at our uphill loaded movement. We had 6 athletes who conducted 2 hiking trials on consecutive days. And each athlete was randomly assigned to one of two groups. Group one acted as a control group and did both the trials without poles. And then the group two athletes did the first day with poles and the second day, the first day without poles and the second day with poles. And so in terms of ages, both groups, right around the early 30s, both male and female, um, fit athletes, and both trials were conducted on the exact same course, 1,000-meter stretch of the track, the mountains boot pack trail. So they literally took the exact same course up, and the path covered about 3,200 feet horizontally, but it went to the top of Snow King Mountain here, and it's about 1,500 vertical feet in distance. And it's a steep hill, average grade of 47%, so it's a pretty steep hill going up. The bioharnesses that we use are called Zephyr bioharnesses. They're kind of high value bioharnesses, and they're paired with GPS tractors. The athletes were told to do a self-pacing for both trials, and then their speed, distance, elevation, and breathing rate were collected using the Zephyr bioharnesses, and they have GPS trackers on them. And then at the end of the trial, the athletes were asked to rate their level of exertion on a 1 to 10 scale, just a typical rate of perceived exertion. And so after we did this data and then applied the difference between the two groups, especially between on the second trial between the pole and non-pole groups, the group with the pole said from a perceived exertion perspective, it felt 20% easier. And then the data back from the bioharnesses and that the equation I spoke about previously, we found there was a 10% more efficiency for the athletes who are using trekking poles.
What are some of the limitations inherent in your studies? Or if you wanted to think about it this way, if you could do this again with an unlimited budget, how would you do it differently?
The big limitation is such a small sample size, right? And so, we just had 6 athletes, and that's just one of the limits. So would this apply to a much broader range? I'm not sure. The one thing about these athletes is they're all fit athletes, which is good. A lot of times you'll see these studies that are done with, college kids off the couch, and they're really not that fit. And all of them were skiers or snowboarders, and so they'd done a lot of backcountry skiing, so they knew, how to hike uphill, which is good. One of the problems I think that we had with this study was that the vertical speed was up to the athlete and not necessarily designated by the bioharness that we had on them. It doesn't measure vertical speed. We actually have done a couple studies where we just used some Suunto ambit 3 watches that measure vertical speed so that it can put a governor on your speed instead of having the athlete self-select it. And that way it can almost be easier to do this type of study. We did one similar where we wanted to test the difference of loading on uphill movement in terms of caloric burn. And using these watches, these Suunto watches, we were able to put a governor on with our uphill speed and then do one trial unloaded, one trial loaded, and just simply using the Suunto watches, take a look at the caloric burn for both and see what the increase in caloric burn was. So there were two main issues with this study: was that the small sample size, and then secondly the vertical speed. We asked the athletes to kind of try to go at the same pace each time, and we leave it up to athletes that can't be super. It's not as specific as we like it to be.
That issue of fitness is one that is a good segue into my next question, which is I've heard advocates on both sides of the argument here, but do you think that trekking poles offer the most benefit to people who lack mountain fitness or for people who already possess a high level of mountain fitness?
It's certainly from just from a balance perspective, if you're getting your ass handed to you hiking uphill, having those poles will help.
Yeah.
So that would seem to indicate that it would be better for, or maybe more advantageous for someone who wasn't very fit. And mountain fitness is a broad term. We like to be even more narrow. We call it and we actually have a mode which we call uphill movement under load. And so we've actually done studies in terms of, does running transfer to hiking uphill under load? Not very well, right? So if you want to train hiking to hike uphill under load, you got to actually go out there and do it, or do what we call step ups. But yeah, I don't know if I have a good answer for that. Based on this study, it's going to make you more efficient. In my own anecdotal experience, it seems to make at least me and others faster going uphill. But if you're burning, a lot harder to do it, maybe you may or may not be more efficient. But I really do like them for going uphill personally. But some of the guys I work with, they don't use them. But at least for from a backcountry hunting perspective, which is why I'm mostly in the mountains, I really like them for coming downhill when I have 150 pounds on my back.
Yeah, I can imagine. I know personally with me, as I started intentionally training and became more fit, it became faster. I felt like the use of poles, at least with a light load on moderate trails, did increase my speed because I could catch going off balance here and there and things like that. But under a load, um, I really really appreciate them because it's so much harder to try to rebalance that load when you go off kilter. And so, I echo the same anecdotal experience, but I always wondered if someone who is completely out of shape, do they get the most benefit, or is it someone who has trained intentionally and has a high level of fitness if they're getting the most benefit? So yeah, it's an interesting conversation to have.
I think we probably have some more work to do on this. It can also depend on if you're on trail or off trail. Even this Snow King example, it's a boot packed trail, but it's not like a smooth forest trail in the Bridger Wilderness. And my anecdotally, I find trekking poles to be awesome, especially going uphill off trails, which is what you do a lot when you're backcountry hunting. But then sometimes when I'm on a Forest Service trail, because the trail isn't quite wide enough for the poles, sometimes it's hard to use them. So it's kind of an interesting the way they would kind of work or don't work for me. I have found that now that if I'm going horizontally or downhill and I don't have a heavy load on, I don't use them a lot. But all the time going uphill, I use them.
Well, Rob, are there any questions that you feel like we should have asked, but we just didn't have enough information to know we should ask it?
One of the things that kind of judges what studies we're able to do is how much interest there is in it, and it seems maybe you guys, because you're in the, I know it seems that in the backcountry hunting world, trekking poles are a piece of required kit now for a lot of guys, just because of the heavy load coming out. I don't know if it's the same in the back, like just the light back packing world. It seems they come on more and more, but in other words, if they're used by everybody, maybe we don't need to be studying them anymore. Maybe that decision's been made already, but I don't think so. I don't think you didn't ask anything. I think you identified kind of what the problems with these studies were, and where perhaps we have more work, which would be to definitely put a governor and make sure we are able to maintain the same speed. And with some new gadgets, perhaps we're able to do that.
All right. Well, Rob, thank you so much. If people want to find your website, where should they go?
Just mtntactical.com.
All right, Rob. Well, thanks for your time. We appreciate it.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Bye. Our next guest has been a Backpacking Light member since November of 2010 and has been a frequent and valuable contributor to our forums through the years. He's got several decades of hiking experience in the Adirondacks of New York, among other places, and has probably seen more trends come and go in the outdoor industry than most of us. It's our pleasure to welcome Jim Marco to the podcast to talk about trekking poles.
All right, Jim Marco, thanks for joining us on the Backpacking Light podcast.
I thank you. Real pleasure to be invited.
So, Jim, can you tell us a little bit about your backpacking experience?
I grew up on the farm in the Catskills, basically my grandfather's farm. My uncle used to take me hunting and fishing quite a bit. I started out when I was about 6 years old. Later on, I moved to Ilion, got married. We had a couple of kids. I used to take them out 2 to 3 weeks a year. Even to this day, dragged me out again for another week's camping with each of them. About 1980 or so, I got very interested in ultra lightweight packing, and my gear kit at that time was right around 30 pounds or so. I spent the next 15, 20 years driving down the base weight. I got to about 4 pounds for me and about 3.5 pounds for the wife. That was a good kit, but one night it got cold and it was not very comfortable. We rebuilt my kit and her kit up to about 11 pounds. I know we can go lighter. It's just a matter of conveniences. That's about where I am today, doing the same thing for the past 10, 20 years, I guess.
So tell us a little bit about your home trekking area. Where do you hike the most and what is the terrain like?
The terrain here, I live in Ithaca, New York, but it's up in the hills a little way. Varna is a small town just outside of Ithaca itself, a little ways off campus. The Finger Lakes Trail goes right by here, and I've hiked most of that. It's quite hilly, up and down, up and down, up and down. I don't think we have a level spot in sight.
Yeah, I've seen pictures of that area out there. It's absolutely beautiful and it looks actually kind of rugged and
Yeah,
rocky.
it's nice to hike. It's excellent for grapes, has good wine.
Jim, the question of whether or not to use trekking poles can be a little contentious in the backpacking community. Where do you land on this and how come?
I believe age has a lot to do with it. As they say, you start out on four legs, you go to two. As you get older, you end up back on three. A typical pattern. A lot of the younger hikers I've seen out in the Adirondacks in that area don't use them much. They're very confident in their abilities to go climbing over rough terrain through creeks. They just walk right through them. They don't pay much attention about getting their feet wet or any of that. They don't look for a little better crossing rather than swimming halfway across. Their ligaments and tendons and their bones are all a little bit more flexible. They don't worry too much about falling, twisting an ankle, breaking an arm, any of that stuff. Older people like me tend to avoid that stuff. So I really believe in a large measure using trekking poles is kind of dependent on your age.
Do you think it's a confidence issue related to age, or it's an actual it's the process of aging and your musculature and joint system deteriorating as you get older?
I think it's more towards your body is just degrading as you age. It becomes more important to go a little slower, not climb quite as high, or use a trekking pole. Yes,
I assume you use trekking poles, yes?
I use one. Yes.
Okay. And is it a folding pole? Is it a collapsible pole? What type of locking mechanism does it have? And is that what you prefer and why?
My current pole is actually a homemade, make your own gear type thing. I made out of an old panfish fishing rod. They're carbon fiber rods. They usually come with a butt cap and a plug for the other ends, and it's all stored inside.
So it's a telescoping thing.
Yeah, but they wedge together. There's no eyes or anything on it.
Okay.
So I just throw all the excess away and drill a couple holes and use a couple bolts for the strap, and that's what I use for a trekking pole. Very stiff.
Is your motivation for this because there's nothing like it on the market that you want? Is it to save money? Is it just because you like to tinker? What's your reason for doing this?
Oh, there's a lot of reasons, yeah. Single piece poles are lighter. Cannot ever get a two-piece pole and not have something in the way of a connection mechanism of some sort. That always weighs more than no connection mechanism. I've used a bunch of different ones over the past 40 years or so. Used to use old ski poles. I've used old sticks off the ground when I needed them and then just gave them a toss at the top of the hill, so to speak. I like the twist locks because they're very clean when I'm going through scrub, bushwhacking, and things like that. They're very clean. They don't catch on all that stuff. Flick locks have a tendency to catch a little bit. I've actually used them and fallen where I've caught the lock and it flipped open and I didn't realize it at the time, but I put it down the next step and I was on my butt, literally.
Yeah, I can echo that. I've had that happen to me too, and I've my solution for that has been to just really tighten that thing down so it can't accidentally open. And then one trip in Washington, the brush was so thick that I actually ended up wrapping duct tape around the flick lock mechanism to prevent it from opening.
Yeah, yeah, I've tried both of those methods. The flick locks have a tendency to break also. I broke one right at the hinge part, and that was probably my fault from over tightening it. Put enough stress on those little hinges, and they just don't handle the stress all that well. I've come down large hills over boulders, and I actually bumped it on what I felt was a bump on a larger boulder, and I happened to click it open, and before I could do anything with it, I had put pressure on the actual lock itself and broken the hinge there. So I've broken a couple of hinges, and I really don't care for flick locks because of that, even with duct tape on them.
Jim, what type of grip material do you prefer on the handle of your trekking poles, and why?
Well, I don't use any grips.
Because your panfish rods have a foam grip on them, right?
No, there's no grip whatsoever.
So it's bare carbon.
Yeah, they do have a strap bolted to the top. I've used several different strap mechanisms, and they all tend to be problematical. They all get locked up either from dirt, grit, snow, ice, you name it.
Yeah, I saw your handle and strap that you posted on the forum. So we'll be sure to link to that in the show notes so people can see what that actually looks like.
Okay, yeah, that's right. I'd forgotten I had put that picture up there. I don't use any grip whatsoever. The one thing I don't like about not having a grip is the very top of it. Coming down hills and stuff, steep hills, quickly found out not to use that top. I put a blister on my palm that made me remember. I turned it around a little bit because I was using the forehand, the ball of my hand, so to speak, to put on top of it, and I haven't had any problems since. But still, it's one of the poorer arrangements, I guess, for the top of a pole. Grips actually did supply a good wide base for my hand to grab onto. In every other case, they're just in the way. I don't ever use a grip. I use it with a couple of fingers, like pointing a pencil. The poles are very light, about 4 ounces, and I just can point it around like a pencil. I can point it at the ground like a pencil, and that's the way I much prefer it.
Yeah, there's so much elegant technique that goes into using a minimalist pole like what you got. It's really impressive, actually.
Yeah, it's a nice little pole.
So, what are your thoughts on anti-shock trekking poles? Have you ever used them, or do you have any feeling about whether or not an anti-shock mechanism is valuable?
I don't know. I used them. I had two sets that actually used them. Must have been 20, 25 years ago now. And in both cases, the springs were a little bit too strong to be called anti shock. They just didn't work unless I was really bearing down tremendously. I mean, like over a rock, something like this, where I had my full weight on it. Otherwise, the springs didn't seem to work all that well. They have a kind of a mushy feel to them, you know. I don't generally bother with the shock absorber stuff. However, my little home built poles there have a rubber grommet down at the bottom, or a rubber cap of some sort anyway, that seems to work extremely well for cushioning those little shock, like from as you walk, you're tapping on a rock or tapping on the ground or something like this. You basically don't get a lot of feedback from that. You know what I'm saying?
Does your shelter set up with your trekking pole?
My shelter is a tarp. It's actually designed around a 48-inch trekking pole. Fits one pole. That's all it needs, and that's all I ever use. So that works out very well. It's also a good defensive weapon. I think Ryan mentioned that in his article there. I kind of got a kick out of that.
So, Jim, with such a minimalist pole and a shelter that only sets up with one pole, have you ever been in a situation where you bust a pole and suddenly you don't have a way to prop your shelter up?
No, I'm usually in the woods, and I can always find a stick long enough to prop up my tarp. It's not a real terrible thing if I have to actually cut a small branch under those types of conditions. But usually I can find a piece of downed wood all over the place.
So I have a question about your current setup. Do you see any limitations based on your personal preference that you wish your current homemade pole had that you might try on the next iteration of your build?
Other than a wider cap at the top, I hadn't really thought about it. I've built several sets of these, and they just seem to be working, and I don't go any further with them.
Jim, what do you say to people who think that trekking poles look silly or unesthetic?
Well, the bears don't really care what I look like.
Surprisingly, this comment is all over the internet, and part of it is the internet effect where people just like to say things. But I've actually had conversations with people who are embarrassed to carry trekking poles because they fear how they look, and it always kind of blew me away that would be a driver versus the function or non-function of a pole making the decision on whether you carried them or not. In your opinion, what type of backpacker is going to get the most benefit from using trekking poles?
Oh, getting the most benefit out of trekking poles? Uh, I would say it has to be the older crowd. I'd say above 30. Generally, I've run into three groups of people out there. Like I say, the young crowd that doesn't use them, the older crowd that are starting to learn how to use them, and the older crowd that just up and up needs them. Everybody can benefit from them to some degree, but some people don't really care to. Depends on the mileage also. Going between 15 and 20, 25 miles a day, that's a long day, and you need some kind of help with them. What a pole does is distribute your energy not only from your legs, but to your shoulders and your arms and your wrists. And it doesn't necessarily mean that a young person has more energy when I go hiking with my daughter, for example. It's just they can't keep up with me because I'm using the pole a little correctly, and they're just kind of swinging it around willy nilly. People with heavy packs will benefit quite a bit from it. No matter what the distance they're traveling, if they can relieve some of that load down to their shoulders and arms, down to the ground, rather than having it all on their back and all on their legs and their hips and their knees and so on. If you have an injury, the pole becomes more of a prosthetic than anything else.
I'd certainly concur with your conclusions there. I think that's a great summary. I've used poles twice when I've had injuries. One was a knee injury hiking in Montana in the early 2000s. And had I
Mm-hmm.
not had a pole as a crutch, I would have been in pretty sorrowful shape. And the other one was I broke my ankle up in Alaska, and having two poles to find my way and limp to an airstrip was absolutely critical for my safety. So I rarely leave poles at home, although I don't always have them in my hands when I'm hiking. So yeah, I concur for a safety item, and especially with groups, we always try to make sure we have one or two sets along at all times.
Well, thank you, Jim. Thanks for joining us here on the podcast.
Great chatting with you.
Yeah, you guys have a good night now.
Okay, Ryan, so let's actually dig into some solid facts and research here. I know you've pulled up 6 or 7 different studies that you found that talk about trekking poles.
Yeah, and I've posed 6 questions specifically that I want to talk about today, and then we can kind of dive in and see what the scientific peer-reviewed research has to say about these questions.
So the first question that you have here is, do trekking poles improve balance?
Yeah, this is $1 million question for me because been one of the drivers that motivates me to carry trekking poles, and I have to qualify this by saying I find them most useful on terrain where I'm most likely to come off balance, which is rugged, steep, off trail, things like that. And so the first study I wanted to point to came out of Willamette University, And we'll link to all these in the show notes so you can reference them. And it's called The Effects of Hiking Poles on Balance. And they're looking at knee angles and specifically in female hikers, but I don't imagine there would be huge differences in balance between men and women. But what they did was they gave a control group no trekking poles on an incline, 20% incline, and then they gave a sample group trekking poles, and they compared the two, and they're looking specifically at knee angles because knee angles are known to have a significant impact on one's balance when you're walking. And they didn't really find any conclusive evidence. Now, part of it is these are very controlled studies, and they're not really out in outrageous conditions. One thing the author noticed was that the group of women hikers they were studying was quite experienced. They were experienced hikers, and they were all relatively fit. And they were hiking on an incline of 20 degrees, which is pretty steep. And they all felt pretty comfortable about it, which was one thing I thought that was interesting that the authors noted that. So one thing they suggested was that, well, maybe we would have got different results if we looked at a less fit or less experienced group of hikers, or maybe an older group of hikers and things like that. Jim alluded to one of the benefits he enjoyed from using a trekking pole was balance, and especially as he ages, it gives him more confidence and things like that. So um, here's a mark against trekking poles providing some balance. But again, I have to think that as your pack weight goes up, as your speed goes up, and as the terrain gets more difficult, trekking pole becomes more valuable.
Well, yeah, and the other thing to think about there, if you're talking about balance, I guess you could be talking about, you're walking along, your sort of balance on average, right? But then you have outlying moments where you slip or you're on a narrow ledge or the scree, slides out from underneath you. And in those instances, the trekking pole for balance becomes much more, I think, significant.
The second study I wanted to look at that kind of addresses that is out of Utah Valley University, and it's called The Acute Effects of Chronic Trekking Pole Use on Static and Dynamic Balance. But as an introduction to that article, I wanted to read an excerpt from the International Mountaineering and Climbing Federation, because they suggest that, or they had suggested at one time back in the 1990s, that continuous pole use has an adverse effect on acute balance. But let me read the statement. It's really interesting. Quote, continuous use of hiking sticks can decrease the hiker's coordination ability, and through this, his steadiness, although in his own mind, he may feel safer. This disadvantage is becoming more and more evident and can lead to certain balancing problems, especially in difficult mountain areas where stick users cannot use their hiking sticks. In fact, the most common type of hiking accident, the fall made by tripping or stumbling, can actually be made a greater risk as a result. For these reasons, such accidents occur even during the use of sticks. Honestly, I think this is one of the most ridiculous statements that has ever come out of a governing body. So, in our experience in the past 12 years of running Backpacking Lights Wilderness Adventure program, I've come to the exact opposite conclusion. And I would prefer that people had sticks with them and that they're fit. So, those two things together can go a long ways to being safer in the mountains. Anyway, this is the question these researchers were asking. And what they concluded was that trekking pole use did not have a negative effect on balance tasks. And it was refreshing to read it. It was actually a pretty good study, and helped us understand a lot about what goes into balance and how trekking poles can benefit balance.
Right. Yeah. That's really interesting. Essentially, what you're saying is it's not a zero sum game. It's not be fit or have trekking poles.
No, I don't think so at all. In fact, I think the two do go hand in hand, and there's probably some benefit at the extremes. So for the people who have the least amount of fit and least amount of coordination, trekking poles may be able to catch their fall if they normally wouldn't be able to catch it. And then at the other extreme end, for people who are really super fit and have the upper body strength to capitalize on them and they move fast, trekking poles may allow them to move faster and have better balance. And we'll get into that question as well.
So the next question you have here is, do trekking poles reduce muscle fatigue?
So the research on this question is fairly sparse, but I did run into a study out of Korea, and it was published in the Journal of Physical Therapy Science in 2016, so it's fairly recent. The researchers were investigating the effects of using trekking poles on muscle damage, cartilage damage, and fatigue during downhill walking. And what they found out was that people who'd used trekking poles had lower levels of the types of chemicals in their blood that were indicators of muscle and cartilage damage. And, anecdotally, I use trekking poles a lot on the downhills. In fact, that's probably where I prefer them the most for a couple of reasons. One, we already alluded to, was balance, but the other one is I do believe they reduce impacts on my knees and things like that, especially if I'm moving fast. And this research tends to support that. Now, the only caveat with this study was that they only looked at obese women, and I want to explain why they did that. It's because this is the highest risk group for muscle and cartilage damage as a result of impact exercise, and so they knew that with this subject group they could get results that were measurable and statistically significant. That doesn't mean it's not transferable to the rest of our population, whether we're obese or not, whether we're fit or not, whether we're a man or woman. The impact forces still have a meaningful effect on your fatigue on a downhill trek. So I think this is a nod towards trekking poles being a benefit to avoiding muscle and cartilage damage. So in the same journal, a different research group out of Korea, and I should qualify something. A lot of the research on trekking poles and hiking science in general is coming out of Korea. And the reason for that is because in South Korea, hiking is such a integral part of that culture, much more so than even here in America. And it's really remarkable to see. They have a very innovative look at health and recreation, and hiking is incredibly popular there. So anyway, this group out of Korea was looking at the effect of walking with and without Nordic pole use on upper extremity and lower extremity muscle activation. And the conclusion from that is that muscle activation can be directly tied to muscle fatigue. So the more activated these muscles are, and they do this with electrical pulse measuring and things like that, EMG data, and the more active the muscles are, the more likely they are going to fatigue later on. So what they discovered is that the use of trekking poles uh, created increased muscle activation in the upper body, which is sensible. I mean, you're holding these things in your hand, you're moving your arms and shoulders more, and it would make sense that your upper body would become more fatigued. But interestingly, they noted no difference in pole use for lower body muscle fatigue and activation. So, um, again, I think if you look at the extremes, carrying a heavy pack and you're not very fit and you're going downhill in rough terrain, I think trekking poles have the ability to improve your balance, stabilize you, reduce muscle fatigue of going downhill, things like that. But for fit hikers, or the more level the ground you're on and the lighter your pack is, maybe it doesn't have as much of an impact on reducing lower body muscle fatigue as we once thought.
So the next question is, do anti-shock devices reduce load impacts on body musculature?
This is an interesting one. There's a review that was published in the mid 90s. And in that review, these researchers claimed that trekking poles provided extra balance, more sure walking, reduction of stress, the common things that you read in the marketing literature from trekking pole manufacturers. So this group published a study in the Sport Journal, and their whole purpose was to investigate these claims, and specifically they wanted to look at so-called anti-shock trekking poles. And so they took a bunch of subjects and subjected them to their standard hiking protocol. to compare the use of standard, anti-shock, and no hiking poles. And they were investigating the impact forces um, from carrying a pack and using or not using trekking poles, and using or not using trekking poles that have anti-shock mechanisms with them. And they measured this by looking at the ground reaction forces that the foot um, made when the hiker was walking. So they took experienced backpackers who all had been using hiking poles for at least 5 years. They threw a 40-pound backpack on them, and they had them walk to a metronome cadence so that their gait was similar across all of the experiments. And then they had a piezoelectric force plate that was positioned in the floor, and they were able to measure the forces on the hiking pole and on the foot when they struck the floor. So again, these guys found that there were no differences in foot reaction forces among the three conditions, which were no poles, standard poles, and anti-shock poles. And so this idea that anti-shock pole manufacturers put out there that these poles reduce impact is questionable. And I think it's one of these things that is kind of a marketing gimmick. And we talk about this in the Trekking Pole Gear Guide. And looking at the anecdotal data from the vast majority of at least our users at backpackandlight.com, most of them can't stand anti-shock devices. And the complaints range from the noise they make to the vibration and rattle, which, I get that. But there's a significant number of people who do not like the feeling that a pole is giving away when they plant it. And if I'm going downhill with a heavy pack and I'm using my poles for stability, I do not want any feeling of insecurity in my pole plants. So my feeling is that the science tends to support that these really don't have a great impact on reducing load impacts.
And it seems like the market agrees with that too. I mean, you just don't see many of these types of polls out in the world.
I think you're not seeing them now. I mean, I think you did see them in the 90s when pole use was exploding. But I think I think this was an opportunity for pole manufacturers to sell people something that had this neat technology in it rather than selling them something that actually could benefit them.
All right, the next question is, do trekking poles allow you to go faster?
This is probably one of my favorite questions to discuss because um, this is one of the key benefits that I personally get out of trekking poles. And it's also one of the key benefits that's supported by science. And one of my favorite studies illustrating this is out of the biomechanics research laboratory in Vail, Colorado. And it's by Wilson and colleagues, and they did a study called the effects of walking poles on lower extremity gait mechanics. And so their whole purpose of the study was to determine whether walking with poles reduces loading to the lower extremity during level hiking, but more importantly, they wanted to study the three-dimensional gait mechanics of how does trekking poles affect the gait. And so while they didn't come up with any strong conclusions regarding load impact and load bearing, which we've already discussed before, they did see that there was a significant difference in the kinetics of a hiker's gait between walking with and without poles. And specifically, they noted that the use of walking poles enabled the subjects to walk at a faster speed with reduced vertical ground reaction forces, vertical knee joint reaction forces, and reduction in the knee extensor angular impulse and support moment. So, what that really means is that if you are moving fast, the faster you go, the more impact you're going to create on your body. And this is where poles have some benefit. So it's a really fascinating study and certainly is in line with what I've experienced anecdotally.
Is there anything in there, like when we say fast, what are we talking about? Are we talking about 3.5 miles an hour?
Yeah, so we're talking about the kinds of speeds that may be faster than a lot of us hike on a trail with a heavy pack. So their walking speeds were about 3.3 miles per hour without trekking poles, and then the use of trekking poles gave them a speed boost to about 3.6 miles per hour with for the same amount of impact and forces and things like that. So if you're looking at these are reasonable hiking speeds for like through hikers and people who are young and fit and things like that. So certainly within the realm of what we would experience. And I have to think that these were unloaded subjects. They weren't carrying a pack, but if you put a backpack on a subject, I would think the difference would be even more magnified.
Yeah, and you mentioned through hikers, and that's one thing that sticks out to me about all these studies is if there's anything that's a truism in through hiking, it's that the scale of it magnifies everything. So if you have a squeak in your pack that bothers you slightly on a 6 hour hike, it's going to drive you crazy for 5 months, right? So when I look at these things, I think, okay, even if it just helps a fractional amount, that is going to add up for someone who's out on the trail for a long period of time.
Yeah, I can only imagine.
Okay, so the last question you have here is, do trekking poles save energy?
Yeah, so Rob alluded to this in his study where they're measuring rate of perceived exertion and oxygen consumption and found that there was an energy benefit only when going uphill, but not when people were on flat ground. And so the last study I'll highlight comes out of Anderson University. And this was specifically looking at what are the physiological effects of using trekking poles, right? So do they decrease energy? As an ultralight backpacker, I want them to decrease my energy because then I can carry less food or I can go farther on the same amount of food, etc. And their conclusion was that they actually increase energy. And so part of this is motion and movement of your upper body while carrying trekking poles is usually higher than when not carrying trekking poles. So there's some energy expenditure there. Um, and the other issue is that the the hope that we have for reducing energy is that we're going to reduce the loading on our primary musculature, which is our lower body, and they didn't find that at all. And that's consistent with some of the other science we've read. So, based on the overall body of literature that I found, I don't think you're going to save any calories by taking trekking poles. I think we've got to look at the other tangible benefits of trekking poles versus strictly physiological ones like this.
So, looking at these 6 or 7 studies, and we have more linked in the show notes, what can we definitively say about trekking poles based on science?
I think we have to be extremely careful about what manufacturers are telling us about the benefits of trekking poles. So, we spent the last little bit of this episode looking at the scientific basis for things like do they improve balance? Do they reduce muscle fatigue? Do they do anti-shock devices reduce load impacts? Do trekking poles allow you to go faster? Do trekking poles allow you to save energy? And the science is all over the map on a lot of this stuff. And for most of those physiological and load impact type questions, I think the answer is no, there's not a direct link between the use of trekking poles and physiological benefit in terms of improving balance and improving speed. I think there's a definite yes. Trekking poles have a significant impact in those areas. And then there's all these other benefits that trekking poles have. And that's where we'll spend the next little bit of our episode.
Yeah, so what we're going to get into next is just some common thoughts or sometimes even just feelings about trekking poles. And so we're really going to dig into some of these statements and we're going to try and determine if these are factual or fictional statements, or maybe if they're somewhere in between. We have collected these statements from a lot of different sources. Some of it's just anecdotal experience, some of it's we've combed the forums, we've combed the internet. So hopefully this is a pretty exhaustive list here. So the first thing I want to talk about is this statement: there's a right way and a wrong way to use trekking poles.
I don't know if there's a wrong way. Um, I often find myself carrying collapsed trekking poles in my hands while I'm hiking clearly I'm not using them. Some would argue that I'm using them the wrong way, I suppose. Um, but again, it goes back to what's your objective for using the trekking pole? Is it for a stream crossing? Is it because you think it's going to reduce load impact? Is it to improve your speed, et cetera, et cetera? So for me, using trekking poles for routine hiking based on improving my gait and my speed, I think there's definitely optimal techniques for using them, and we'll link it to the show notes. But there's an article at Backpacking Light called "Hiking Poles Technique," and it outlines the gas brake coast method, which I found personally to be the most effective way to use trekking poles for improving your speed on a trail. And it's really about rhythm and when you're applying pressure to the trekking pole, when you're releasing it, and when you're swinging it. It's really all about that rhythm. And that article has some videos and a very detailed description of how to use that technique. And it's the best I've ever seen written about the subject.
Yeah, rhythm I think is the key, and just sort of a mental thing too. I found that when really going up difficult slogs, concentrating on the rhythm of your trekking poles and your form there can give you something to think about other than your lack of oxygen. And it can actually kind of help from a psychological standpoint too. So the next statement is trekking pole straps are useless.
When I got my first pair of trekking poles, and this was probably, and I don't even think they were trekking poles, I think they were ski poles, but I never hiked with them. This was late 80s, mid 80s. And the first thing I did was I cut the straps off because I thought, well, I'm not skiing, I don't need straps. And I wore them like that for a couple of years and didn't really think anything of it. And then I broke one on a hike, ended up borrowing one pole from my hiking partner that had straps on it. And I used the strap and I thought, oh my gosh, how did I ever survive without trekking pole straps? So I will argue that in some cases, trekking pole straps are probably more useful than the grip. And I know there are some cottage manufacturers who place a lot more emphasis on the strap that they put on their pole rather than the grip. And then there's another half that place the emphasis on the grip rather than the strap. And for me personally, in my technique, I like to grip with less tight of a grip, and I like to
Hmm.
rely more on my strap. It gives me more uh, potential to have good rhythm and things like that. But then when I'm off trail in some really gnarly terrain, I find myself using both equally because um, there's some types of terrain that you have to have a grip on your pole so that you can place it precisely.
Yeah, I would echo that for sure. And the other thing about straps is they are useful in dicey stream crossings and fords. I actually lost a trekking pole on my very first day on the Appalachian Trail, trying to cross a swollen stream in Maine because it didn't have a strap on it.
So let's talk about the idea, and I've seen this in online forums, including our own, was that trekking poles were invented by gear companies to make money. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't think that's true. It certainly doesn't match. If you look at the history of where trekking poles came from and how they sort of came from the skiing world and the Nordic countries, it seems more like it's just something that was adopted uh, because they're useful.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I think trekking poles represent the optimization of the old time hiking staff. And if you look at a staff, we've all done this as kids and even as adults, grab a stick and walk with a stick. And why do we do that? Well, it feels good. There's some things that a stick or a third leg or a fourth leg, in the case of two trekking pole users, do for your balance and stability that's useful. And if you look at the evolution of the single pole hiking staff, eventually those staffs came with straps, and they were used much like trekking pole straps are used today, by resting your wrist into the strap and allowing that strap to take some of the weight so you don't have to grip the staff so tight. And I think trekking poles simply represent a way to lighten the hiking staff and make it more suitable for technical terrain. And, admittedly, today's trekking poles are a lot sexier than a big old stick. And I do think they probably sell more as a result of the technical looking nature of it. But to say that they're not useful or that they were invented by gear companies to make money that's reaching.
Well, while we're talking about trekking poles and single sticks, that's something else that you see a lot is that trekking poles are inherently better than using a single stick or a staff or a broom handle or so forth. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I've done both. I've hiked with one and I've hiked with two. Most of the trips that I do with one tend to be easier trips, and I will take along a trekking pole to set up my shelter, help with stream crossings, and give myself and my hiking partner a crutch if one of us gets injured. And for me, that's the ideal one stick scenario. So one stick is better than none for sure, but two sticks are better than one as your pack weight increases and the terrain difficulty increases.
So, how about the idea that there are some situations where trekking poles are more useful than other situations? We've sort of touched on this a little bit.
Yeah, I would say river crossings are probably one of the most valuable areas where I think trekking poles are useful. And then at the opposite end of the spectrum, I think they're totally useless in talus because there's nothing worse than shoving your trekking pole on a angled rock and then having it slip out from underneath you, especially in a situation where you are better off, better served by using your hands. And then there's all these other scenarios in between, right? So, um, again, I'm going to go back to this and I keep repeating it, but it's worth repeating. The faster you go and the heavier your pack is and the more difficult the terrain is, and perhaps the less stable you are. If you're an older person or if you're not as fit, then they could provide some real benefit.
I actually find myself sometimes using trekking poles in Talus.
Tell me more.
uh, Well, sometimes what I'll do is use one trekking pole in Talus, and I will use it because being 5'6", sometimes I find myself reaching out for some stability that I can't actually quite reach. So I'll use it not as I'm stepping down into things because I agree you don't want that slipping out, but sometimes I'll actually use it as like a horizontal stabilizing method.
That's a great use of trekking poles and talus. Actually, I've done the same thing, and I think this goes back to why I like a good grip on my trekking pole, because when you're in talus, you can't obviously just rely on the strap because that pole has to stay in position as you move from one location to another. So yeah, that totally makes sense. So another claim that's out there is that trekking poles are a ridiculous amount of money, and it's not hard to identify that. Some of these pole models are in excess of $200 for a pair, and the counter to that is that cheap trekking poles are just as good as expensive trekking poles. What do you think about that?
I think that there is a middle ground, like so much in life, and this is actually one of the things I like about our gear guide is I think it really kind of highlights this. But I think if you have something that is hitting the ground every 2 seconds, over hundreds of miles, you want it to be well engineered and you want it to be well constructed. And usually that means that it is more expensive. Now, does that mean you have to go out and drop anywhere between $150 to $200 on a trekking pole? Personally, I don't think so. I mean, if you're down into the ounce shaving game and that's where you're at, then that's fine. But no, I think you can find a quality pole for in between 50 and $100 that's going to last you a long time.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. In doing this gear guide, I looked at a lot of poles that were made by kind of Chinese OEM manufacturers. And so these are the poles that you find ending up in Costco under the Cascade Mountain brand. And even some of the cottage makers are rebranding these and selling them as their own. And I, they're cheap and they're pretty bad. And I have found in my experience that the harder you use poles, the more likely they are going to break and not last. And not be able to fix on the trail because they're plastic parts that just shatter. And there is a level of quality that I'm not willing to compromise on, because if I'm going to put my body weight on a pole, I need it to be stable every single time, not just every time up until it breaks, right?
Mm.
So for me, I tend to spend more money on durability, and there's a middle ground, like you said, that I think um, is worth spending the money on if you're serious at all about hiking on a regular basis, or if you're doing a long hike or a through hike or something like that. And then there's another level that you get into with the most expensive models, and specifically, I'm thinking of Leakey's and Black Diamond's pro level models that have the all metal adjustment mechanisms in them. And there's a level of durability once you get up there that is a step up even above the middle ground. And so if you are guiding, or you're going to use trekking poles at their limits with a very heavy pack or on very difficult terrain, then I kind of recommend that people spend the money.
Totally. So Jim touched on this a little bit, but the next part is trekking poles are most useful for aging hikers who need the extra support and balance. And I'll say from my own research, it seems that hikers that are 50 and above tend to be the most, anecdotally, tend to be the most vocal supporters of trekking poles.
Well, I'm 48, so I have to exclude myself from this club. However, my body behaves differently at 48 than it did at 28, and I find myself starting to benefit from age-related balance issues, especially if I'm carrying a heavy pack on a long expedition. And I've come to appreciate good trekking poles more now than I did 2 decades ago.
One of my favorite things about going on the trip to Montana with Backpacking Light over the fall was one of the guides for BPL, Kevin, does not use trekking poles, and he kind of just sticks his hands in his pockets and strolls along, and he always just looks like he's just out for a Sunday stroll. He's just always so cool looking, and the rest of us kind of look nerdy with trekking poles compared to him. Compared to him.
Kevin is special and has a level of fitness that comes from, frequent steep backcountry skiing and things like this, and he's a runner, and he's a bit younger, so he's got some positive things going for him. So we'll see how he's doing in 10 years.
So, how about the idea that trekking poles are most helpful when using a heavy pack?
This is a hard one for me to sort out, because part of me believes that they're most useful when carrying a light pack because they help you improve your speed so much. With a heavy pack, they help improve your balance and stability. So I think the benefits are different at either end of the spectrum. So the answer to this claim is, yeah, I think trekking poles are helpful when using a heavy pack, but I don't think they're unhelpful when using a light pack. I just think the benefits are different. So the next claim we can address is the use of trekking poles for fording rivers or rock hopping across creeks. What do you think? Are they essential?
Like so much else we talk about in this episode, I think it depends on the case, and the person. Um, I would rather have trekking poles when fording, for sure. I'd rather have trekking poles when doing certain types of rock hopping across creeks, but other types, if I'm more jumping across, something onto bigger boulders, I'd want to land and be able to stabilize myself with my hands if I wanted to.
I've used trekking poles in the middle of a small stream to jump across that stream and stay dry. And that technique is a really fun technique to use. It can be done safely without risk of an ankle injury or anything like that. But you absolutely need trekking poles to do that. Otherwise, you're going to have wet feet. The the issue of rock hopping, um, I I can't stand it when people hop rocks. This is one of the most common ways to injure yourself
Mm.
hiking, is slipping off a rock or a log that you're trying to balance on across the creek. Invariably, these things are slippery and wet, And it's just not a great idea. I'd rather wade the creek with my own 2 feet.
Mm-hmm.
And but then there's the bigger stuff, right? There's the rivers that have larger boulders in them and fast currents, and I think these are the kinds of freestone mountain rivers you find in the Beartooths or in the Sierra. And I think trekking poles can provide a huge benefit there because you can't ford these things quickly. You've absolutely got to be stable, otherwise you risk things like foot entrapment, and trekking poles can be a huge benefit there. But then you take the other kind of river, which is the gravel bed river that you find in Yellowstone or up in the Arctic. And the technique for crossing rivers like that is more fluid, and you're often just kind of walking downstream with the current across a riverbed that's made up of small gravel. And there, I don't think trekking poles are useful. And I do see people crossing streams and rivers like this with poles, and they're fighting the current instead of going with it. And so
Mm.
where foot entrapment isn't an issue, I think it's safer to go down with the current and be more fluid in your crossing.
So our last question is going to segue us nicely into the gear section here, and it's talking about trekking pole technology. So talking about locking mechanisms, folding versus telescoping. Is there any piece of trekking pole technology that you feel is inherently better than another piece of technology?
Yeah, I would love to see us get away from plastic latching and locking mechanisms. They are inherently prone to failure. They are probably the number one thing I've seen fail over and over and over through the years of using trekking poles. And now if I really have to rely on a locking mechanism for off-trail use, I'm looking for something that's metal and solid. And pretty much the only two companies that make bomb-proof locking mechanisms in a latch form are Black Diamond and Leaky, and they're only in their higher end poles. In terms of uh, there's carbon and aluminum. There's huge arguments about that. Most of the trekking poles in our gear guide were carbon. Not all carbons are the same, and so the thinner the wall and the thinner the diameter, the more likely that carbon's going to break. And so it's another area where I'd love to see trekking pole manufacturers, at least for that lower section that is most likely to get stuck in rocks or mud or snow, is made of a more durable, thick walled carbon material so it's not so prone to snapping.
Well, let's jump into the gear section and dig into the gear guide a little bit. What was some of your favorite pulls that stuck out to you from that?
Personally, my favorite in the entire gear guide and the one that pleasantly surprised me was the Rutilacura Yanas. Um, the carbon in these poles is very strong. It's very stiff. The locking mechanisms are based on a very simple expansion nut, but it worked well. Incredibly simple design. The sample I received did not have straps, so I did miss a strap. I've heard mixed reviews on Rutilacura's straps, so um, I'm not sure what to say about that, but they're certainly easy enough to grab a strap off another pole and screw it into the top of this one, and it works fine. So yeah, it was the lightest pole in our review that's still on the market. Gossamer Gear has the LT3 and LT4, and both of those models are being discontinued now. So that leaves the Rutilacura as the lightest poles on the market. And their shaft design is terrific and a lot stronger than I had originally anticipated.
And did you find that there was a difference between the lightest pull in the gear guide and the pull that was the easiest to swing in the gear guide?
I found the Rutilacura is the easiest to swing um, for that weight class. Now, bump up an ounce or two, and you get into the Compardel single piece poles. And years ago when Backpacking Light was designing and selling gear, we released a carbon pole called the Stix, STIX. And my whole objective in designing this pole was to design a pole that had an easier swing weight than any other pole in the market. It was a single piece pole, so it didn't have the weight of, latches, and it had a very simple strap and grip and a lightweight tip. Anyway, Compardel made these poles, and the Compardel pole that was featured in the gear guide, the single piece pole, is the same shaft that was used in the Stix. And until you swing a pole like this, compared to your typical three-piece carbon or aluminum pole, it's hard to appreciate the benefit that a lighter swing weight can have. And that Compradale pole, there is something special about carrying that, and it's one of my favorite poles for on-trail use.
How about the sturdiest pole? Did you find that the sturdiest pole had something to do more with material, or did it have more to do with design?
I was surprised again by the Ruta Lucuriana at how sturdy the carbon was in those poles and how stiff they were. Obviously, it's a very limited feature set. They have limited range of adjustability and rudimentary handles and things like that. But for absolute durability, um, the heavier poles is where it's at. And the Mohn's Peak 9 Tiger Paw carbon, the REI Flash carbon, and the Leaky carbons all were very durable poles. Definitely a nod to the Leakies, just the components and everything else was just a little bit higher end. And I would have more confidence with that pole in extremely rough conditions over the long term than probably any other in the gear guide.
And what pole stuck out to you as the sort of do it all? What was the most versatile pole in the gear guide?
My pick is the Black Diamond Distance Carbon FLZ. So this is a folding pole. It folds down to an incredibly small size, which I love for two reasons. One, travel, and two, if I'm running or day hiking and I'm carrying a tiny pack and I need to stow my poles on or in my pack. It's got some adjustability to it, unlike the Black Diamond Distance Carbon Z. So there's the Z model, which is non-adjustable, and there's the FLZ, which is adjustable. And the FLZ model has a range of adjustability that is typical for most users, and just an incredible feature set in a very light pole. The other pole that really surprised me was the Mohn's Peak 9 Tiger Paw Carbon. Of all the poles that I tested, this probably had the best package for the grip. And by the grip, I mean the actual hand grip, the extended grip below the hand grip, and the strap. And it's just a really comfortable, versatile grip style.
Awesome. Well, there's lots more to dig into with the trekking pole gear guide. It's definitely worth a read. We'll put a link to it in the show notes so you guys can find it. All right, our last segment of the day is hiker hacks, and we're going to be talking about some common trekking pole failures that happen and what you can do about them if you are in the field. So, the first thing to discuss is what happens when the locking mechanism just completely fails. You're walking along, and all of a sudden, boom, you've got a pole that's 3 feet shorter than your other pole.
So it depends. If you're hiking solo, virtually your only recourse is to carry spare parts. And that is something that almost no trekking pole user will do. Spare parts are hard to come by. They do fail though. And, I don't worry about it for most of our group trips with the Wilderness Adventures program, because there's always other people carrying poles that you can loan a pole to somebody if they really need it. But when I've had locking mechanisms fail, pretty much the only way I've been able to repair it, borrowing a spare part, is to carve a plug out of a stick and insert it into the shaft and then glue and duct tape the heck out of it so that the pole no longer adjusts at that mechanism point. So there's not a lot you can do. There's a trick from fishing rod builders that works really, really well, especially with carbon poles. And that is if you're joining two poles together using one of these plugs, we call them ferrules, then you can take some cord or really thin rope like guy line cord and wrap a couple inches above the join and a couple inches below the join, and then load it up with epoxy or barge cement or something like that. And that creates a lot of strength in the ferrule that prevents the pole from snapping at that location. But the answer is there's no good way to fix a failed locking mechanism. And that's one of the reasons I kind of pay real close attention to that and choose poles that have good locks on them.
Now, are those similar techniques to what you would do if say, the tip sheared off in the bottom of a rock or in a scree field or something, or if your carbon fiber just snapped in two?
You could do that. The most important thing to do when a tip snaps off is to protect the rest of the carbon. And the way to do that is, one thing I really like to do is I'll do a mixture of sand and epoxy, because I carry epoxy in my repair kit. It's all mix a slurry of that, and I'll pack it into the bottom of that tip. And then I'll protect the outside of it either with some string or cord and epoxy and some duct tape to protect the very tip of it. And usually that's sufficient to get me through the trek.
Oh, that's cool. Well, one thing that I've run into in through hikes is the you put so many miles on a pole that the plastic that surrounds the carbide tip of the pole wears away to the point where the little carbide tip actually falls back into the pole and rattles around. And then what happens is the plastic just continues to wear down even further and further as you walk along. I don't really have a solution for that, so this would be one of those crowdsourcing things where if a listener has run into that problem before and wants to send us an email at podcast@backpackinglight.com, we'd love to hear what your solutions are.
I'd be very eager to hear what people do for that too.
All right, well, that's going to wrap it up for the Trekking Pole podcast, Ryan. This was a good episode.
This is great. Fascinating talking to both Rob and Jim and hearing their experiences and diving into some of the research here.
Yeah, for sure. And y'all don't forget to go look at the Trekking Pole Gear Guide. It's really worth your time, especially if you're looking to make a purchase anytime soon. Well, this podcast is brought to you by backpackinglight.com, which has been providing information and education about lightweight wilderness travel since the year 2000. The Backpacking Light podcast is supported by subscription fees paid by our website subscribers, and we are so grateful for your support. A backpackinglight.com subscription can save you time and money on your quest to lighten your pack weight, spend more time in the outdoors, and connect with a community of like-minded hikers. So if you aren't yet a backpackinglight.com subscriber, please consider subscribing and gain access to nearly 1 million forum posts, 4 million words of original content, more than 2,000 articles, and access to our super fun Wilderness Adventures trekking programs. You can subscribe right now at backpackinglight.com/subscribe.
And if you have feedback, questions, or tips for our listeners, please share them via email at podcast@backpackinglight.com. You can download the show notes for this episode at backpackinglight.com/podcast. And finally, this podcast is available on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play, SoundCloud, and YouTube. Leave us a review. It helps other people find the show.
Thanks so much for listening to the Backpacking Light podcast. I'm Andrew Marshall.
And I'm Ryan Jordan. And if we can leave you with one party message, it's this: pack less, be more, because lighter is better. Happy trails, everybody.
So I shoulder my backpack, walk away from the